Losing a loved one is terrifying, especially at a young age, when this cruel world has not yet had time to harden a person. But even worse is being under unfounded suspicion when everyone around you, even your own mother, begins to suspect that the murder weapon was in your hands. Riza Trexler was born on October 10th in the 1968 in the small town of Salisbury, North Carolina, with a population of about 30,000 people. She was the eldest child in the family. 2 years later, she got a younger sister named Jody. Riza was described as a smart and kind-hearted girl who was always willing to lend a helping hand to those in need. She was positive and cheerful, so it was no surprise that her younger sister looked up to her. It made perfect sense. They even shared the same room in the family home. Of course, they had occasional misunderstandings and arguments, as most siblings do. But overall, their bond was so strong that many would envy them. On June 15, 1984, 15-year-old Riza and her 13-year-old sister Jody decided to have a get-together with their friends. School was out for the summer, and they invited a couple of friends over to their house. Their guests were classmates named Paul and Jim, who lived nearby. As far as anyone knew, Jim had feelings for Riza, but she wasn't interested in a relationship and preferred to stay just friends. The teenagers made sandwiches, had a snack, listened to music, watched TV, and chatted. Later, Riza decided to visit her grandparents, who lived nearby. Around 3 p.m., the friends left for their own homes. Riza stepped out of her parents' house and headed next door. In this neighborhood, many of their relatives lived close by, and they were all very close-knit. However, when Riza arrived, she found that no one was home. Her grandfather had gone to the supermarket to buy groceries, while her grandmother was at the hair salon. Since both cars were gone, it was clear that no one was there. But this didn't particularly upset Riza. She had a key to the house, so she let herself in and sat down to watch TV while she waited. Jody, on the other hand, didn't go with her sister right away. She stayed behind at their parents' house to finish up some things. About 20 minutes later, she finally decided to go to their grandparents' place, but upon noticing the absence of their cars, she assumed that no one was home and turned back. Around 5 p.m., their grandfather, Walt, was the first to return home. Their grandmother was still at the salon and would be back a little later. The moment Walt stepped inside, he noticed signs of a struggle. Things were scattered around the room. He immediately suspected that a robbery had taken place. But what awaited him in one of the rooms was far more horrifying, so much so that he screamed. Jody, who was in the neighboring house, heard his voice. Recognizing her grandfather's scream, she rushed to her grandparents' house. She tried to understand what was happening, but Walt wouldn't let her inside. Chaos ensued. Neighbors and relatives gathered. Eventually, Jody managed to get inside. There on the floor of the guest bedroom lay Riza. Someone had covered her with a blanket so that no one would see the mutilated body. According to Walt, his granddaughter had been stripped of her clothing, but her jewelry, bracelet, watch, and ring remained. The victim had suffered multiple stab wounds to her upper chest and neck. When the police arrived at the scene, it was already clear that there were no signs of forced entry. Moreover, nothing appeared to have been stolen. The fact that all of Riza's jewelry remained on her body suggested that robbery had never been the perpetrator's intention. Instead, their motive was far more sinister. Relatives who lived nearby gathered at the family home, horrified by the gruesome, bloody scene. Everyone had the same burning question: who could have committed such a monstrous act against a teenage girl? Speculation ran wild, ranging from a serial killer roaming the area to a vengeful stalker or a rejected admirer of Riza. The victim's body was taken to the medical examiner's office in North Carolina. The autopsy revealed that Riza had suffered 18 stab wounds, most of them deep puncture wounds. Additionally, there were clear signs of strangulation on her neck. It was likely that the murder weapon was a steak knife. The attack was so ferocious that the blade had snapped off and remained embedded in her shoulder. Riza's injuries were severe. One of the stab wounds had nearly severed her spinal cord. Even if she had survived, she would have been paralyzed for the rest of her life. There were also numerous defensive wounds, indicating that she had fought back against her attacker. Given that her body was found unclothed, investigators immediately suspected a sexual assault. Their suspicions were quickly confirmed when male biological fluids were discovered on the victim. These samples were collected for further analysis. In fact, the killer had been extremely careless, leaving behind a wealth of forensic evidence. Unidentified fingerprints were found at the scene. Under Riza's fingernails, forensic experts discovered DNA, specifically fragments of the killer's skin, which had likely been scraped off during the struggle. Several strands of hair were also found on Riza's neck. Unfortunately, these hairs lacked the necessary follicles for full DNA profiling. However, forensic specialists were able to determine that the coarse, dark hair belonged to a man of African American descent. Despite the abundance of evidence, DNA profiling technology at the time was not advanced enough to identify the perpetrator. As a result, all collected materials were archived for future use. Jody was one of the last people to see Riza alive. This was confirmed by the two boys who had left the Trexler home before Riza headed to her grandparents' house. According to Jody, she and her sister had parted ways, but she later decided to go to their grandparents' house as well. However, upon arrival, she noticed that both cars were gone, meaning her grandparents weren't home. She didn't check whether Riza was inside. The house seemed empty, and everything was quiet. Assuming that Riza had either gone with their grandparents, headed home by herself, or met up with friends, Jody simply returned to their parents' house. She later heard her grandfather scream while she was still at home. Looking out of her bedroom window, she saw Walt crying and clenching his fists in anguish. Terrified, Jody ran straight to her grandparents' house to find out what had happened. No one in Riza's close circle could recall any African-American acquaintance who might have been capable of such brutality, let alone someone who was close to the 15-year-old girl. However, when questioning local residents, investigators found indirect confirmation that a suspicious African-American man had been seen near the crime scene. 9 people told similar stories, claiming that after the alleged murder, a middle-aged black man was seen running through the neighborhood. He appeared frightened. No one raised the alarm since they hadn't heard the girl scream. He managed to kill and assault his victim without making a sound. There were some discrepancies in the neighbors' descriptions of the stranger, but overall, the story seemed believable. Despite clear evidence that an African-American man had attacked the schoolgirl, including forensic clues, detectives began searching for the perpetrator indiscriminately. The first suspects were teenagers, Jim and Paul, who were friends with the girls and had parted ways with them right before the murder. Some people speculated that the boys might have had feelings for Riza. They did not even deny that they liked her. However, the boys firmly denied any involvement in the crime. Investigators collected their fingerprints and DNA samples for analysis. Both teenagers provided alibis, which were checked and confirmed. After meeting with the Trexler sisters, they had been at home with their parents at the time of the attack. It was clear that Jody had been nearby when her sister was killed. The 13-year-old schoolgirl also ended up on the list of suspects, despite how absurd that idea seemed. After all, it was obvious that a black man had committed the crime. The local community was deeply shocked by the girl's murder, and disturbing rumors began to spread. Somehow, the idea surfaced that Jody herself might be the killer. These rumors gained traction, and the detectives did nothing to dispel them. In reality, the slain girl's sister was never officially a suspect, at least not until more and more people started viewing her with suspicion. During the teenager's funeral, the rumors against Jody only intensified. Many believed she was too emotionless and cold during the tragic event. From that moment on, even the investigators began paying much closer attention to her. Despite being only 13 years old, Jody was interrogated without her parents present. She was pressured and repeatedly asked why she had killed her sister. Jody was in tears, protesting and insisting that she couldn't have done this to the person she loved most in the world. Nevertheless, DNA samples were collected from the girl. Given the behavior of law enforcement officers, even the suspect's mother began to doubt her daughter's innocence. Gradually, her loved ones started turning away from her, which was a devastating blow, especially during such a difficult time. The police were unable to find any leads that could connect the crime to the black man they initially suspected. However, there was also no evidence against other suspects on the list. Detectives couldn't link the brutal murder to anyone, so they decided to involve the FBI in the investigation. After creating a psychological profile, a suspect profile was published. Contrary to expectations, it didn't even match the actual data gathered during the investigation. It was believed that the suspect was a white male between the ages of 18 and 24. He must have known his victim. The young man likely felt remorse after the murder, blamed himself, and sought a way out of the situation, making him even more emotionally unstable. 5 months had passed since the brutal murder, but the investigation had reached a dead end. Finally, Grandpa Walt spoke out against the local police. The elderly man claimed that the authorities were not making enough effort to solve his granddaughter's murder. However, this did little to advance the case. Months turned into years. The Trexlers were tormented by uncertainty, desperately wanting to know the name of the killer and to seek justice. During this time, Jody suffered the most. Even 4 years later, rumors about her involvement in her sister's murder had not subsided. If anything, they had only worsened. These rumors spread to social media, were echoed in mass media, and even led to the creation of groups dedicated to accusing Jody of being a murderer. Over time, public interest faded, and Riza Trexler's case was ultimately shelved among unsolved crimes. Progress was finally made in 2018. 34 years after her sister's murder, Jody agreed to appear on a television show to prove her innocence live on air. Even as an adult woman, she continued to face the consequences of unfair accusations, so she requested a polygraph test. It turned out that the police had never conducted one before, not even when Jody had repeatedly asked for it to clear her name and remove all suspicion. By that time, Jody Trexler was married and had taken the surname Laird. She had children of her own, yet she still vividly remembered her sister's mutilated, blood-covered body. More than anyone else in the family, Jody wanted to find the murderer. Not only had the killer taken her beloved sister away from her, but Jody was also devastated when her own family turned their backs on her. The accusations had started with strangers, but over time, the widespread condemnation escalated into something much worse. Even her own mother voiced her suspicions, trying to talk to her, saying she wanted to know the truth and wouldn't be angry. That was the final blow that shattered Jody. By her own admission, she no longer wanted to live. The accusations were absurd and deeply traumatic for her. Determined to prove her innocence once and for all, Jody sent an email to the producers of a television program. Fortunately, they became interested in Riza's case. Jody then gave a detailed account of her memories from that fateful day. She recalled that when she ran to the house, her grandfather wouldn't even let her inside at first. Until the last moment, Jody thought that something terrible had happened to her grandmother. When she finally entered her grandparents' house, she saw Riza covered with a sheet. By that time, the fabric was completely soaked in blood. She didn't know who had done it, but she believed her grandfather had covered the body to shield others from the horrific sight. Jody continued speaking in disbelief, saying she had no idea why everyone had turned against her. She saw it as either a malicious setup or the result of law enforcement's neglect and suspicions. To this day, she still didn't understand why the police had taken such a strong interest in a 13-year-old girl. Jody had all possible DNA samples collected, and she was questioned more than any other suspect, even more than the rest of her family members. After the murder, some of her friends immediately turned their backs on her, outright refusing to speak with her. The situation worsened as rumors spread. Nearly every day, Jody returned from school in tears, wishing desperately for the killer to be found, believing that only then would the torment end. She had no idea that she would suffer for more than 3 decades. Under this immense pressure, Jody began having behavioral issues by the time she reached high school. At 15, she ended up in a rehabilitation center for abusing alcohol and marijuana. It was her way of escaping reality and numbing the pain. The prejudice she faced from those around her made Jody bitter toward the world. She became rebellious and acted accordingly. Jody wasn't the only one who appeared on the show. Her neighbor, Laura Lear, was also there. She had lived just a few houses away from the Trexlers. Even as a child, Laura genuinely believed that Jody had always been different from the rest of her family, cold and distant. She was considered an outcast, and suspicions against her had only grown stronger since the funeral, where she showed little emotion compared to the rest of her relatives. Some also claimed that Jody hadn't been getting along with the victim in the months leading up to the murder. However, when the results of the polygraph test were read aloud, Laura apologized to Jody as the test confirmed her innocence. Still, for many, that wasn't enough. Skeptics clung to their doubts. For example, Riza's best friend insisted that even if Jody wasn't directly involved, she must have known something. The theory was that even if she hadn't killed her sister, she had been close enough to the scene of the crime to know more than she had told detectives. However, the polygraph showed that Jody was telling the truth when she said she didn't kill her sister. Interestingly, Jody's decision to speak out after so many years reignited public interest in Riza Trexler's murder. A young detective named Travis Schollenberger decided to review the case files and re-examine the evidence from the 34-year-old investigation. He was moved by Jody's courage in taking a live polygraph test. When his efforts became known to the family, Jody personally thanked him, as the thought that Riza's murder had gone unpunished still haunted her. Fortunately, all the evidence from the case had been preserved. On December 3, 2019, the Salisbury Police Department announced that they had new information on the previously unsolved case. A press conference was held with the Trexler family. The first order of business was to fully exonerate Jody. The police now knew who had killed Riza. It was a black man with a criminal past. Parabon Nanolabs had created a profile of the suspect using innovative genealogical analysis techniques. This led them to a criminal who had committed another brutal crime and served time for it in the early 2000s. However, the killer had already been dead for over a decade. Technically, the case was closed. The Trexlers had mixed emotions. On one hand, they now knew that the man who had murdered their daughter was no longer a threat, and the public could rest easy. On the other hand, they were left wondering if they would ever truly understand why he committed such a horrific act. According to Schollenberger, the Salisbury police detectives did significant work investigating the unsolved case, conducting re-interviews and speaking with everyone involved in the original investigation. The police became particularly interested in reports of a black man seen running through the area, presumably after the girl's murder. They reanalyzed all the items and evidence collected during the search for the criminal. Cooperation with forensic laboratories began, and over time, authorities realized the necessity of using genetic genealogy. This method had been developed just a few years before the reinvestigation of the crime, but had already proven itself as a cutting-edge and highly effective technology. The resulting profile was compared with publicly available databases. This not only included CODIS, which is exclusively linked to law enforcement, but also independent databases where anyone could voluntarily submit their DNA profile to contribute to the database. Authorities also reached out to the public again to gather new information, particularly to learn more about the suspected killer. At the same time, laboratory analyses were being conducted. A new publication about the case of Riza Trexler, murdered in 1984, was released. Several concerned individuals came forward, but they could not provide any valuable information. All this was already known. As before, there were some contradictions. Overall, the stories matched. It was about an adult man who did not match the profile created by the FBI during the initial search. He appeared to be a large black man, around 40 years old. However, no further valuable information about him could be provided. Descriptions of his clothing and shoes slightly differed. When authorities began to recheck the preserved evidence, DNA samples were collected from swabs and biological fluids left by the killer. The resulting profile could not be identified using CODIS, so it was sent to Parabon Labs to create a genetic and genealogical report. The method worked in April 2018 when the name of the person, whose guilt was beyond doubt, was first revealed. Decades after the crime, modern technology provided an answer. From the time of the murder until the period when Riza Trexler's death was solved, around 100 suspects had been identified. To reconstruct the killer's profile, the biological fluids collected from the victim's body were uploaded into a public genetic database. After that, specialists from Parabon conducted what's known as reverse genealogical tree development of the suspect. This allowed them to identify several possible killers, and eventually the circle was narrowed down to just one. However, at the press conference, his name was never announced because he had passed away long ago. But now the authorities were able to clear the name of Jody, who had suffered for decades from biased treatment by everyone who knew her and had grown up alongside her. As law enforcement agencies in the U.S. increasingly use genetic genealogy to track down criminals, more and more questions are being raised by the public. People are concerned about whether such research can be considered an invasion of privacy. Most of the databases where DNA samples can be sent for analysis, in addition to the collection, openly collaborate with the police. Against this backdrop, many disagree with the company's policy. Interestingly, even witnesses who came to the station after all these events still considered Jody to be a criminal. She perceived this as a form of violence. To maintain privacy, the criminal's name was initially kept secret. It's hard to put into words how much Jody lacked such care in the past. According to her, even after the criminal's identity was established and she successfully passed the polygraph test, she still felt the pressure. with some people not believing her. However, the press conference where the district attorney firmly stated that no members of the Riza Trexler family were involved in the murder brought a lot of comfort to everyone. Negative attitudes towards the innocent, rumors and lies also affected Danielle Lurd, Jody's daughter. Because of this, she was bullied at school, being labeled as the daughter of a murderer. Though to a lesser extent, she also had trouble making friends. Once her school friend was supposed to stay over, but when the girl's parents found out that Danielle's mother was Jody Trexler, they forbade it. Riza's killer lived 2 hours away from the girl's home and worked at a factory just 2 blocks from the crime scene. The criminal's name was Curtis Blair. He was a black man, and at the time of the murder, he was 40 years old. He was large, as witnesses had described him from the start. Curtis Blair was born on October 26, 1943 in San Diego County, California. Little is known about his life, but rumors say that his father was a very cruel man, which led him to grow up in a very unfavorable environment. After some time in his teenage years, he decided to move and began a journey across several states in search of a better life. By the time of the bloody crime, he already had a criminal past, which included a significant sentence for an assault with a deadly weapon. The stabbing began as the culmination of a robbery of 2 men. For this crime, Curtis was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He moved to a new place 2 years after his release. Also, a couple of years before attacking the schoolgirl, he had kept his dark nature hidden. For a time, Curtis had been hiding from his bloody past in San Diego, before making the fateful decision to move to North Carolina. All that remains of Curtis is a small knife that was seized by investigators. It was obtained and sent to the forensic laboratory. There were suspicions that Riza had received knife wounds from 2 different items. It was believed that the criminal took the second one from the execution site. However, no blood traces were found on it. Yet when authorities began searching for the criminal, it quickly became known that the man had died on August 4, 2004, from heart failure. At the time, he was incarcerated for another criminal episode. Throughout his life, he never confessed to the brutal murder of the girl. Curtis's grave is located in the Memorial Park Cemetery in Salisbury. In June 2019, investigators exhumed his body and collected materials for DNA testing, which were then compared with the existing criminal profile. On August 6, 2019, Curtis Blair's profile was found to match the killer's profile almost 100%, eliminating the risk of error. The probability of a random match was too low to leave any doubts. The evidence seemed compelling enough to confirm that the case was finally solved. If you enjoyed my work, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let's discuss this story in the comments. Thanks everyone, and goodbye.